Hey everyone, this video is a review of the SwissMicros DM32, a modern-day homage to the HP 32S2, an RPN calculator released in the mid-1990s. And as many of you will know, the 32S2 was the intermediate level RPN calculator from HP's Pioneer series, but many people preferred it over the more advanced 42S. Most operations are accessible directly via the keyboard. It had a simpler programming model and support for fractions and an equation solver, neither of which were available on the 42S. And for a lot of people, the 32S2 was a sweet spot that gave them just what they needed in a daily calculator, especially if they didn't require advanced complex number or matrix support. And so I was really interested to hear that SwissMicros was developing the DM32. It seemed like a great opportunity to solve three critical limitations that it had that I mentioned in a previous separate video. Most notably the single line display, the extreme lack of memory, and the lack of I/O for saving and restoring data or programs. And now that DM32 is coming out of its development phase with the first official firmware version soon to be released, thanks go to SwissMicros for sending me this review copy in exchange for my honest thoughts. And DM32 has been in development for a number of years. Like with DM42, it is using emulated code and it's not based on an HP ROM, so SwissMicros needed to develop this from scratch. And they've also taken the opportunity to upgrade the hardware platform with a new processor, memory, and a USB-C port. And they've continued to refine the overall product experience, right from the unboxing experience through to comprehensive online documentation and even around how the internals look. But most notably, SwissMicros have announced they'll be selling a printed version of the DM32 user manual, which I think a lot of collectors will appreciate. So SwissMicros have really rounded out the whole product experience. And from a hardware point of view, the most obvious comparison points for DM32 are both the original 32S2 and SwissMicros' other flagships, such as this DM42. And the DM32 has the same case as the other flagships. It's made from stainless steel with matte black PVD coating. It also uses exactly the same e-ink-like display, so it will display an image even when it's turned off. And but when I got DM32, I thought it might have been higher contrast display than DM42, but it turns out that this perception was just due to the new large high legibility fonts used, and they're really great. They fully use the screen space available. And you can see that the blue and orange labels on the keyboard are also very highly legible. The keyboard itself is almost identical to the original 32S2 in layout, the only difference being the extra setup menu and the addition of this dedicated row of soft menu keys. And it uses the same clicky tactile keys as used on the later DM42s and the DM41X. And obviously they're not designed to replicate exactly the feeling of the original device. They're more clicky than the Pioneer keyboards, but they're certainly very high quality and I enjoy using them. Another change I appreciate is the inclusion of a USB-C port, which is an upgrade from the micro USB ports used in their previous flagships. Sometimes it's difficult to find a micro USB that works with the DM42. You need to find one that supports data connections and is not too deep for the port. But with USB-C, all cables support both power and data, and they have a standard depth. DM32 also includes the same infrared transmitter as the DM42, which is compatible with the original HP 8224A and B printers. And now if we turn over the device, we can see the back. So there's four feet to stop the calculator from slipping. We can also see a reset switch and some text switches laser engraved, including the serial number. One of the great things about SwissMicros devices is they continue to be very easy to access the internals. So I'll undo these two screws now. And the PCB in the DM32 is really striking, with the OWL logo etched in reflective gold on the board. And it's a delightful detail that you'd only notice if you're curious enough to open the case. And so on the top left of the PCB, we can see that there are instructions about how to remove it safely to access the keyboard. We would first need to remove this LCD connector before unscrewing these two screws. We can also see the STM Cortex M33 system on a chip, which runs at 160 megahertz when the calculator is powered via its USB connector. It runs at 48 megahertz when the calculator is only powered by this internal CR2032 3-volt battery. So the battery's not recharged by the USB cable, and it will need to be replaced at some point. And on paper, the processor is twice as fast as the one in the DM41X and DM42, but since they're all running different software, you won't necessarily find that difference in performance on any particular task. Of course, it is dramatically faster than the original 32S2. The processor has 2 megabytes of internal flash memory, but we can also see this external Micronix 8 megabyte flash storage chip. And this is accessible when the DM32 is plugged into a computer and enabled as a USB drive. So it is important to be aware that there are 2 flash storage areas in the DM32. We can also see the USB-C port here, the infrared transmitter, and the buzzer. So one of the nice things about the DM32 is it's possible to do a quick tour of functionality in a relatively short amount of time. But before we get into it, it's useful to know that we can always access the quick reference guide using the top left soft key. We'll also have a look at settings. So in here, as well as setting the date and time, we can adjust the stack alignment to right or left alignment. There's also 5 different stack fonts to choose from, so I'll pick a high visibility one. And of course, DM32 is an RPN calculator with a 4 register stack. So to calculate 2 plus 3 times 4, we'd enter those numbers onto the stack and then hit multiply and plus. And DM32 supports the same 120-bit floating point precision as DM42, which can store around 32 significant digits. So for example, we can calculate 25 factorial, and then we can hit the show key to see all the digits. We can also store and recall values directly from 26 single letter variables. So we can store this value from the X register into variable A, and then we can recall it back. And there's a view command that lets us also view a variable without assigning it to the stack. We can also look at all the variables assigned using the mem command, which is quite useful in some situations. There's also a special variable called I, which can be assigned into, and it's used for indirect addressing. So a value of 1 in I actually corresponds to variable A. So let's store that into I. And then if we recall from the indirect value of I, we'll actually get that value that we assigned into A back onto the stack. And the original 32S2 could only handle values up to 33 in I, but on DM32 there are 2 extra sets of 900 registers which can be controlled only by indirect addressing. So indexes 100 to 999 corresponded to extended registers which are saved in a state file, and indexes -100 to -999 correspond to global registers, which are used as common storage accessible from all states. And I'll talk more about states a bit later. But having all that extra available memory makes a lot of programs possible on DM32 that were not possible on the original 32S2. And DM32 supports the same bases functionality as the 32S2, so that's arithmetic and base, binary, octal, and hex. And values are stored in 2's complement form and obviously support integers only. And values can be up to 38 bits, which in practice is fine if you're a programmer working on a chip with a 32-bit CPU or smaller. So if we pick hex from our base menu, now we can enter hex values with up to 9 digits, so 9 times 4 is 32. And we could switch to binary, and here we see the bottom 12 bits, and we can use the square root and sigma plus keys to scroll through those values. The 32S2 has no bitwise operations, but with DM32's extra memory, we could easily implement those as programs. And I'll switch back to decimal now. And so DM32 also supports fractions, so to enter 1 and 2/3, we'd hit 1.2.3. And by default, DM32 will show all values in decimal, but we can switch to fraction using this toggle here. Because the value that was stored underlying is stored in decimal format, this enunciator shows that it's actually slightly greater than the 1 and 2/3 value that we entered. And with DM32, it's possible to control the maximum denominator and choose from 3 possible fraction formats. And so the implementation of fractions is on the 32S2 and DM32 is really great, and it's quite a unique selling point of the device. DM32 also implements the 32S's support for basic arithmetic and trigonometry on rectangular or polar complex values, and it's similar to the complex number support from the 11C or 15C. So for example, to add 1 plus 2i and 3 plus 4i, we enter the imaginary components on this stack first. So that would be 2i, and then 1, and then 4, and 3. And to add those two complex numbers, we enter complex and then add. If we want to perform a complex trig operation, we also hit complex and then, let's say, sign. We'll switch that back to decimal. Yeah. And so it's also possible to enter complex values using polar coordinates. Before we get into more advanced features of DM32, such as the equation solver and programming, let's talk about the new multi-state system. So users of the DM41X or DM42 would be familiar with being able to load and save states via the file menu. And states define basically the entire configuration of the calculator, including the stack, variables, and programs, and they're both a convenient way to get programs and data in and out of the calculator via the external flash storage, but also a way to switch between different calculator configurations. So for example, you might have one for different application areas like electrical engineering or system programming. And DM32 takes this state system one step further and with its multi-states. And this is available by the 4th soft key. And multi-state allows us to load state and save files from the external flash into the internal flash memory on the processor. So in here we can switch states really quickly just using a few key presses. And SwissMicros describes this as activating a different calculator to work on, a bit like selecting a tab in a web browser. So with multi-state, I will switch calculators to one where I've defined some example equations. And now we can pull up the equation list. And here we can use the up and down arrows to select the ones that we're interested in. For longer equations, we can use sigma plus and square root to scroll through. And you can see that equations here are using various functions. So let's pick my favorite example equation, the distance an object falls under gravity in time t. So to evaluate it, we just hit enter, and we can enter a value for t. So let's say 5 seconds, and the object falls 122.5 seconds. We can also solve for t. So with our equation selected, we hit solve and then enter t. So here we can enter a distance, so let's say 200 meters. And so t would be 6.38 seconds. And DM32 can also numerically integrate an equation. And I guess the solver on DM32 is fairly simple compared to the one on, say, the HP37S, but it does cover most use cases, and I find it quite useful. Another thing with the equation list is if you really want to enter a large equation using arithmetic syntax, you can do it there and hit the enter to evaluate it. So let's switch to another calculator state now that defines an example program. So here we can hit the program key and we can see the listing of the program. Again, we can use the arrow keys to scroll through. And having those 4 lines to view the source code is really nice. So for that program is a simple one to calculate consecutive prime numbers. So to run it, we enter a value onto the stack. So let's pick 3, and then we go execute, and then a label, so P. So the next prime number is 5, 7, 11, 13, and so on. And SwissMicros provides state files for all the programs in the original user's manual, as well as the HP32S engineering applications reference guide. So there are programs for solving simultaneous equations, there's a polynomial root finder, and various financial and statistical calculations. So normally I don't comment about the pricing of calculators. When I look at my variety of viewers, there's a lot of students, professionals, and retirees across many countries and different circumstances. But the topic of price does come up a lot with SwissMicros devices, so I thought I'd share some thoughts. I think SwissMicros makes premium high-end devices. They are priced in Swiss francs, so unless you're Swiss, the price will be affected by a varying exchange rate. But I think it's true that there isn't really anything directly comparable on the market. It is true that buying an original used HP32S2 might be cheaper than a new DM32, but I don't see the DM32 really as a remake of the original. I see it more as a modern update that keeps the benefits of the original, but in so many ways is far superior. I didn't purchase this one, but I do own a DM42 and 41X, and I certainly don't regret buying those. I think they'll last a long time, and I tend to mentally amortize the cost across the years. I believe I'll use them. And they're certainly some of the last calculators in my collection I'd consider selling. I also do use them for work, so I tend to mentally compare their prices with other professional tools I use. But again, I think that cost-value equation is going to be different for everyone. So in summary, I think SwissMicros have done a great job with the DM32. They've really rounded out the whole product experience from their previous flagship devices with the comprehensive documentation and printed manual available, the unboxing experience, and the multi-state feature. I think they've also done a great job of presenting the benefits of the 32S2 being a very accessible RPN scientific calculator, but they've also solved all the limitations of that device. So to me, it's as if HP was still making that product line with the standards before they outsourced their design and manufacturing. In some ways, it's like what the 35S could and should have been. And I think ultimately the various SwissMicros flagship devices are going to appeal to different sets of users, but I think DM32 will be a sweet spot for many people. And so I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. And if you have, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get alerted of new videos.